Great, thank you very much both to Suzanne and Saoirse. So now I'm going to invite Helen as a discussant, who I think is going to look at some of the implications of what we've heard, particularly with reflections on her work in Darfur.
Thanks very much, Margie. Thank you, Suzanne and Saoirse, for an excellent presentation. And I have to say, based on our own work in Darfur, I'm in broad agreement with a lot of what's been said. So as a discussant, that puts me in a bit of a difficult position. So what I thought I would do is try and make three broad points. I mean, the first point is essentially that the livelihoods and protection linkages we've heard about are, they are inextricably linked, and they go well beyond the case studies that Suzanne and Saoirse have looked at. And recognising those links can enhance humanitarian action. But at the same time, I want to give you some examples where those linkages and recognising those linkages can undermine not just humanitarian action, but also erode it in the longer term. And I want to use the example of Darfur. And finally, I think it's worth trying to consider how this analysis can be extended and broadened. Now, the focus for this study has very much been humanitarian action. But I think if we want to look at the ways forward, we have to look more broadly at the wider policy and institutional environment, and in particular the multiplicity of international actions, because humanitarian action doesn't go on in a vacuum. These days, it goes on often alongside integrated UN missions, which also play a major role in terms of livelihoods and protection. I only want to talk for about 5 minutes, but before I start, I just want to say that one of the very particular strengths of this project, from my point of view, is its starting point. And that is the local context. What actually happens to people in situations of conflict, the threats to protection and risks to livelihoods they face, and how they respond. And it's in that context that they're considering operational response by agencies, and I assume they mean INGOs. Now, I think that's really important because an awful lot of studies don't take that as the starting point. They kind of take that field reality as a given. But I think the diversity of experiences in these case studies show that it's not a given, and it's really important that we build our understanding from the bottom up. And just to say that the breadth of case studies is really extraordinary, and I think Suzanne and Saoirse are to be congratulated, especially because they undertook all of these case studies between them. They didn't farm them out. And I think that gives the studies particular richness and depth that other comparative work maybe lacks. So, first point, the two are inextricably linked. You're going to be fed up of hearing that by the time you go, but I think it's actually the crucial lesson. Forced displacement, blocked access to livelihood assets, and constrained mobility are the common characteristics, the common threats to livelihoods in conflict settings. And as we've heard, once people are displaced, their previous livelihood strategies are no longer viable. Now, these findings build on what is now quite a considerable body of work. And I can quote several other examples which you will have heard of. Jeremy Lind in Kenya and Uganda, Simon Narberth and Callum McLean in Somalia, Ratner's recent work in Cambodia, Sierra Leone, Armowitz has recently published material on conflict and livelihoods, Alden Wiley in Afghanistan, conflict between pastoralists and farmers, and of course our work at Tufts University, where we've done a wide range of work on livelihoods and conflict. Now, the clear conclusion is, as I've said, one of the characteristics of conflict zones is that constrained mobility limits livelihood options because it affects all types of migration, access to markets, access to livelihood assets. And that is a basic shared understanding now that I think is indisputable. And so we should kind of move on from there and think about the implications. And it's also worth mentioning, because I don't know if we said this strongly enough, that regardless of the type of civil conflict, attacks on the means of production and other livelihood assets is prohibited under international humanitarian law in black and white. It clearly identifies livelihood assets. And that hasn't gone unnoticed, which leads me on to my second point about how these linkages can potentially undermine humanitarian action. Now, the example I want to share with you of how making this linkages has also undermined humanitarian action relates to Darfur and is a little bit extreme. Basically, forced displacement, blocked access, and living under siege in camps for the displaced was the basis of the ICC prosecutor's warrant for the arrest of President al-Bashir, which added to the former charges of crimes against humanity. So basically, the charge for criminal responsibility for the crime of genocide, the summary of the case actually is orientated around the effects on livelihoods. And if you look at the quote there, this is an extract from a summary of the case. So basically, this is, I didn't want to just read this out, so I thought I'd put it up there for you to read. This is the claim that genocide is by the deliberate infliction on members of the target groups, conditions of life calculated to bring about the physical destruction of the group in whole or in part. So this is about what happened to people after the displacement. And then he talks about the destruction of food, wells, water pumping machines, shelter, crops and livestock, as well as any physical structures capable of sustaining life or commerce, in other words, livelihoods. They destroy farms and loot grain stores or set them on fire. The goal is to ensure that those inhabitants not killed outright would not be able to survive without assistance. And if we could just go to the next slide. We go to the next slide.
We'll go. Whoops, one too far.
Yeah, next one. Yeah. This is followed by 2 paragraphs that is specifically concerned with humanitarian action. He states, the Ministry for Humanitarian Affairs blocks the publication of nutrition surveys, delays the delivery of aid, expels relief staff denouncing such acts, denies visas, travel permits, and imposes unnecessary bureaucratic requirements on aid workers. This has the effect of reducing nutrition and access to medical services for protracted periods of time. Now, this isn't in a humanitarian document. This is in the case Ocampo put about Bashir. So is it very surprising that so many days later, we all know what followed, which was the expulsion of a large number of international agencies and a revoking of the licenses of a number of national agencies? And so I think you get my point, that these charges were directly linked to humanitarian discourses. And this continues. Last week, Ocampo was in New York, and he was presenting very similar charges to the Security Council. In fact, I would argue he's been the strongest advocate for humanitarian needs in Darfur compared with any other humanitarian actor. We hear more from him about humanitarian needs than we do from John Holmes. Now, I would suggest also that having the ICC prosecutor as an ally is actually, not without risk. And obviously, I've selected a particularly extreme example of the politicization of humanitarianism. I think it does actually, the linking of the two does raise issues and questions about how agencies and others can actively support the integration of livelihoods and protection while ensuring that humanitarian principles are upheld and strengthened. Now, I think Saoirse mentioned and made reference to protection principles. And by that, I think she's advocating for humanitarian principles, but perhaps we could hear a little bit more about that. As a result of those expulsions, obviously the humanitarian capacities have been eroded, not just at the time and continuing, but also the agencies that remain are facing increasing challenges and difficulties in providing assistance, and options for providing livelihood responses are for them diminishing. The final point relates to this new modus operandi and particularly early recovery, which is often seen as the kind of the new panacea. And I'd just like to raise some questions as to where and how protection and livelihoods fits within this broader policy and institutional framework. Now, taking the example of Darfur once again, let's just pause and look at these different modalities. We have, for example, the higher level peace processes, which obviously impact directly on humanitarian action in terms of a peace process that's run aground is doing little for promoting peace locally. We have the international peacekeeping and protection forces of UNAMID and the plethora of quick impact projects, many of which are directed at livelihoods. We have the peace-building efforts of the Darfur Community Peace and Stability Multi-Donor Trust Fund, or the DCPSF for short, which also has big livelihoods focus. We have the early recovery agenda of UNDP, who are the cluster lead on early recovery, which is very much about supporting livelihoods. And I've mentioned we have the judicial processes of the International Criminal Court. Now, some of this alphabet soup comes under the umbrella of a UN integrated mission. Now, these missions are increasingly common. In the case studies, there's one in Darfur, obviously, but also one in Sudan more broadly, and there is one in Palestine territories. I don't think there is one. Oh, there's one in Sri Lanka? No, I don't think there is, or Chechnya. But essentially, when I was checking this morning, I think there are about 19. And basically, these structurally integrated field missions, they include a peacekeeping operation, and they combine political, military, reconstruction, humanitarian tasks under one leadership, multidimensional. Now, what does this mean for humanitarian action, and in particular for livelihoods and protection? Well, I have another quote, which I won't labour the point, but I just want to say this has been a big issue for OCHA, and OCHA have concluded that there is nothing inherent in the concept of an integrated UN presence that is contrary to humanitarian principles. Indeed, when devised, organised and operated well, it can help improve the protection of civilians and facilitate humanitarian action. I guess we can ask ourselves, and those of you who are working for agencies who are in Darfur, whether that's actually happened and the implications that raises. The ICRC have argued quite loudly and vociferously at times that such an approach cannot be reconciled with the principles of neutrality and independence. And the reason for that is, of course, combining the political military with the humanitarian. But for that reason, UN OCHA and the Humanitarian Coordinator's Office is often outside of the mission. Now, I'd be interested to know how many of you here actually knew that. Because if you don't know that, how can you expect the combatants on the ground and the beneficiaries in Darfur to know that? It all becomes part of the same people who drive around in white cars. You know, they are all, you have the red crosses, the blue crosses, you know, ones with no crosses. It's very confusing and rather muddling. So basically, in conclusion, the responsibility for coordinating livelihood activities on the ground is still rather vague, with overlapping and duplicating mandates. As a sector, livelihoods do not have their own sector within sphere. And within the UN, they fall under early recovery and, you know, obviously a little bit under the food security coordination of FAO. So maybe I'll just finish by saying that these studies have confirmed the overarching importance of looking at livelihoods and conflict dynamics in conjunction, and obviously this is crucial for providing a principled and appropriate humanitarian assistance and protection as one package. This is indisputable. But as a result of some of the problems, the institutional problems I've tried to highlight, this cannot be done in a vacuum. We have to take on board, take account of that broader policy and institutional context. And in order to do that, I think what we need is a stakeholder analysis, policy review, and actually try and get to grips with some of these overlaps and their implications, particularly for humanitarian action. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much.